They spoke to everyone around them. They spoke to teachers, doctors, and neighbors. But then, for reasons that nobody fully understood, June and Jennifer Gibbons would only speak to each other.
Two sisters, one private language, a private world that gradually pushed the outside world away. They became famous and then infamous, not because they did something huge, but because they built a life that looked like a promise and a prison at the same time. This is their story. How it began in Barbados, followed them to Wales, how they spun a language and a life around each other, how the world tried to break that language, and how one twin died young in circumstances that still divide explanation from myth. June and Jennifer were born to Barbadian parents in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Their early years carried the sun and music of the Caribbean, but the family emigrated to the United Kingdom when the girls were small. The move placed them in a different world: gray, rain, and classrooms where the girls stood out. They were the only black children in their school for a time. Other children stared, teachers misread them, and small cruelties took hold. From a young age, the sisters developed ways to depend on each other. They spoke softly together, planned adventures together, and wrote diaries full of shared stories. Over the years, their language intensified and turned inward. They preferred each other's company to anyone else's. Parents, teachers, and local doctors tried different interventions: therapy, school changes, sometimes harsh discipline. But the sisters' bond only tightened. By adolescence, their behavior had shifted from eccentric to alarming. They refused to communicate with adults. They invented a private code. They wrote obsessively. The notebooks and diaries collected their thoughts, fantasies, and rules. To the rest of the world, those pages were unreadable, a closed system with its own laws. To June and Jennifer, the system was the world. Small acts of rebellion began to accumulate. In one account, they shoplifted inconsequential items and then returned them, an action that baffled authorities but fit into the sisters' own moral logic. In other incidents, their conduct appeared intentionally provocative. It was not mass criminality. It was workmanlike misbehavior, the kind of action that keeps social services busy but does not yet demand headlines. Then, in their 20s, the sisters' lives took a harder turn. Their behavior escalated. They became increasingly isolated and difficult to manage in ordinary institutions. Authorities, worried about safety and social breakdown, made a consequential decision. Both sisters were committed to Broadmoor Hospital, the high-security psychiatric facility. It was a place designed for people the state considered dangerous or mentally very ill. They were not sent as punishment. They were sent because the system at the time believed it had no other meaningful place to keep them. Broadmoor changed everything. It was also a mirror. Inside its walls, the sisters were in a strange position, safer in one sense but controlled in another. They had constant medical observation, qualified staff, and a regimen of therapy and medication. Outside, the press began to notice the case. Stories ran that made the sisters objects of curiosity. Names like the Silent Twins circulated. By then, the public saw them through a mix of fear, moral judgment, and the hunger for an odd story. One of the important tensions in the case is the question of motive, or rather whether motive is even the right word. The Gibbons twins did not act like common criminals. Their acts seemed to belong to an internal logic. The diaries suggested a private mythology. They wrote of pacts and promises. They seemed, as many observers later argued, to inhabit a shared psychosis, a folie à deux, a psychiatric phenomenon where two people share a delusional belief. But shared psychosis is not a simple diagnosis. It exists on a spectrum, shaded by environment, trauma, and mutual reinforcement. Over time, doctors attempted treatment, therapy to expand their social networks, medication to blunt symptoms of anxiety or depression, and structured programs to teach skills. Some interventions had small effects. The sisters sometimes spoke to staff, sometimes participated in activities, and sometimes regressed into silence. The mysteries only multiplied when their private code and diaries remained largely unreadable to professionals. Decoding the inner life of two people who refuse to speak to anyone else is a kind of intellectual trap. In 1993, the story reached a tragic note. Jennifer Gibbons died suddenly at the age of 29. The circumstances invited headline writers and armchair detectives alike. Friends and staff reported that Jennifer's death followed a short illness. It looked like a sudden, unexplained collapse. Some medical records reported a failing organic condition. Other sources suggested complications that were poorly understood. Broadmoor released official statements. Coroner reports included clinical notes. Still, the precise medical picture never satisfied every observer. Two kinds of narratives quickly took shape. The first, embraced by some readers and viewers, was the Pact interpretation. In that telling, the sisters had arranged a metaphysical bargain. One stays and suffers, so the other may go free. It is a dramatic explanation, resonant with myth and literary tragedy. It is also emotionally powerful, because it suggests agency and purpose in a story that otherwise reads as passive suffering. The second narrative is rooted in psychiatry and social history. It argues that Jennifer's death was the result of a complex interplay of long-term psychiatric illness, possible physical conditions, the stresses of institutional life, and inadequate medical care. In other words, it was tragic, but not supernatural. There are documented cases where physical health in psychiatric patients declines unnoticed or untreated, where diagnostic ambiguity leads to outcomes that hindsight later calls preventable. Which story is truer? The public wanted the Pact, the clinicians wanted caution, and both sides could point to evidence that fitted their view. The sisters' diaries hinted at compacts and vows. Staff records noted psychiatric deterioration and medical complications. The tug of storytelling and the discipline of clinic never fully aligned. For the surviving twin, June, life continued on a different trajectory. She was released after many years. The world outside had changed while she stayed inside. Her interviews, when they occurred, were sparse and guarded. The media tried to turn the narrative into a tidy arc: suffering, cure, redemption, but life resisted tidy arcs. The Gibbons story refused to be reduced to a moral. There is a third angle worth considering in any thorough analysis: the role of race, class, and migration in how the sisters were perceived. Two young black women growing up in predominantly white Wales faced a specific set of social frictions. Their difference, which at first looked like mere otherness, likely amplified the response to their behavior. People who deviate from social norms are more easily pathologized when they already sit at the margins. It is an uncomfortable but necessary part of understanding the case. Another uncomfortable truth is institutional care itself. Mid-late 20th century psychiatric practices often did more harm than good. Coercive treatments, lack of community-based alternatives, and sometimes a basic indifference to complex human histories. The Gibbons case sits against that backdrop. When you combine unique pathology, cultural displacement, and a system stretched thin, outcomes can be tragic even when no single act of malice exists. So, could Jennifer have died because of a pact, an intentional act taken to free June? Possibly. It would be a story that fits mythic sympathy and the language of secrets. But the medical and social records point to a more ordinary, if still tragic, convergence of severe psychiatric need, physical illness, and institutional limits. The legacy of the silent twins continues because their story resists one form of understanding. It asks us to hold multiple truths. The sisters had a powerful mutual bond. Their world was closed and coherent to them. Institutions struggled to respond, and a sudden death left a question mark that culture immediately filled with meaning. What the case offers, finally, is a mirror. It reflects how we treat difference, how we narrate tragedy, and how easily the human mind will prefer a tidy story of conspiracy or pact to the messy, often boring truth of missed care and cumulative stress. Whether you are drawn to the idea of a pact or you prefer a forensic explanation, the sisters' lives call for both empathy and critique. If this story leaves you unsettled, that is the point. Some mysteries are not puzzles to be solved, but experiences to be witnessed. The silent twins made of silence, something impossible to ignore. They remind us that the human mind can become an island with its own language, and that language can be both shelter and trap. If you found this account compelling, subscribe for more true stories where evidence and myth collide. Tell us your view. Was it a pact, a psychiatric tragedy, or something in between?